G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous idea for you. Why don't you go ahead and hop on the dark web and hit up a Chinese fentanyl drug manufacturer at one of the largest illicit drug labs in the world in China. Why don't you pose as a drug dealer, fly to China, and get a little tour. Get a little tour with the drug mafia of one of the biggest fentanyl labs in the world. That's what today's guest did. He was going undercover, reporting for his incredible book. It's called Fentanyl, Inc., How Rogue Chemists Created the Deadliest Wave of the Opioid Epidemic. He's written about the fentanyl crisis for the Los Angeles Times, for the Atlantic, for the New York Times. He's an expert in this, and he has an amazing story about how he uncovered and understood exactly what is going on with the synthetic opioid crisis in the United States. Will Donald Trump's crackdowns on the Mexican border stanch the flow of fentanyl into the United States? Why are other rich countries less affected by the opioid crisis than the United States? And how did fentanyl cause the worst drug crisis in American history? You will understand all of that and so much more after hearing this fabulous chat with the one and only Ben Westhoff.
These pills are all just pressed by drug traffickers to look like Percocets. So, you know, if you get a pill from your actual doctor or a pharmacy, it'll be fine. But there's that's the main way fentanyl is distributed now is through pills. And you can buy a pill pressing machine from China that makes it look exactly like a Xanax or an OxyContin or anything you want.
And you would do that if you were a drug dealer. Why?
Well, you sell these pills as the name brand. And so an actual prescription Xanax might cost wholesale like $5 or more. I don't know. But you can get one of these fake Xanaxes and it costs maybe 50 cents to make or something like that.
And is there real Xanax in it and real Percocet in it as well?
No, it's just fentanyl and some sort of cutting agent usually.
I see. And presumably the high school student or the college student who's taking it has maybe never had a Percocet, or the effect is close enough that it feels kind of like it. Like, how similar is the effect of fentanyl to the effect of OxyContin?
I mean, it would probably feel differently. It would probably feel a lot more intense, but it might be too late by the time you even discovered it. I mean, it really slows your breathing down and kind of puts you out of commission.
Right. How did this come about? Where and when did it start?
Well, fentanyl was invented as a medical drug back in 1959 by a Belgian chemist, and was and continues to be a really important hospital drug, but only in the past 10 years or so has it jumped into the realm of abuse. And, at first it was pretty much completely stealth. It was only cut into heroin. And so that's how they kind of Trojan horsed it into the drug supply. But now, in addition to being cut into all these other drugs like heroin, meth, cocaine, and pills, it's sold by itself. And there's a lot of people who try to buy it just as fentanyl as well.
Okay, I'll get to that in a moment. The medical uses, I think I've had it, actually. I think it's quite common, right, in the medical industry. So if you're going in for, if they just need to sedate you for a colonoscopy, or if you're a woman who's going in for like a gynecological exam that's a bit intrusive, they'll stick a needle with fentanyl in. So it's obviously a safe and no side effect or low side effect and useful drug to keep people sedated.
Yeah, I mean, if I was having an epidural as a woman and about to have a baby, I don't know if I would want fentanyl all in, my bloodstream. But but it's
maybe you don't want to get the baby high, but maybe you want to get a little high if they're just snooping around in there.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it's administered by a trained anesthesiologist, that's what they do. And so the amount is safe. You're not going to get hooked if you're just using it one time. But that's the problem. All these drug dealers on the streets, they don't know how to make a safe dose. And that's why they put too much in there.
And when you say get hooked, I'm always a bit torn when we talk about drugs about a missing piece of the jigsaw, which is the first thing that I asked you, which is how it would make me feel. Like anyone who has some experience in addiction with a loved one or with themselves, I think also understands that part of the appeal is not just this kind of brute force addiction where the drug is doing something nefarious to your nervous system and is making you a zombie to go back to it, but also the fact that it feels really fucking good and you want to chase that feeling. And in some sense, there's this kind of Faustian trade-off between you and your future self or you and your long-term self, where you're willing to sacrifice a bit of long-term wellness for the feeling that you get in the short term. Like, how do you think about addiction?
Yeah. I think one guy described it to me who took heroin as, you never realize how much sort of pressure and stress you carry around with yourself all day long until he had heroin and it all went away. And I think, it's very easy to justify it to yourself as this is helping me, not this is like I'm creating a Faustian bargain, but this is helping me become the person I really am, free of stress. And everyone thinks that they're different. You hear all the time about other people who get addicted, but yourself, you know what you're capable of. That's what you tell yourself. And I think that's how it gets started.
Interesting. But even if you know that there's a trade-off, I mean, how much, you've spoken to a lot of addicts, how much awareness do you think that they have about the trade-off? I mean, I've been addicted to nicotine in the past, and I've been addicted to alcohol in the past, and never to such an extent that I've hit rock bottom. But I've been smart enough to be conscious of the fact that there's a trade-off. I've been smart enough to be conscious of the fact that probably if I was a non-drinker, I'd be leading a life that is more stress-free and more fulfilled, and has more time to smell the roses and less hassle and annoyance than being a heavy drinker. But it feels really good to get smashed today.
Yeah.
And like I was quite comfortable with that logic. And it had to reach a point where I was like, you know what, it's just not worth it. The only reason why it feels good to get smashed is because I get smashed all the time. If I'd never got smashed, then I probably wouldn't want to, and I don't. But I was aware of the bargain.
Yeah, well, William S. Burroughs said that it takes a long time to get addicted to opiates. I don't know if it's the same with alcohol exactly, because like you really can use opiates like heroin and fentanyl regularly for a long time before you're going to go through withdrawal. And so and there are plenty of people who do it their whole life. I mean, for decades without really suffering negative consequences. You know what I mean?
Right.
The definition of addiction is not just that it gets its chemical hooks into you, but that there are negative consequences, right? So, your coffee addiction, people don't call it a coffee addiction, even though you go through, same thing. If you don't have your caffeine, that'll be withdrawal, but it's not screwing up your life, and that's the difference with opiates, is that eventually you have to have it or you're going to physically be sick. Although the one thing that's better about opiates is you can't actually die from withdrawal, unlike alcohol. If you just suddenly cut it off, you can die from that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be a serious alcoholic for that to happen. But yes, it can happen. And so is there a subset of the fentanyl using population who knows that they're using fentanyl? They're not the college kid who takes the Percocet. They're aware that they're buying fentanyl. They're aware that they're using fentanyl, and they've basically got it under control. Like they basically, at least for some prolonged period of time, can run a life and operate in this world with jobs and families and be an occasional user in the same way that people do that on a widespread basis. It's taboo to say it, but they do it with drugs like MDMA and cocaine, and they lead perfectly normal lives, but those are the ways that they let their hair down on the weekend.
Yeah, there's certainly, I guarantee you there's lots and lots of people like that. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's not the fentanyl that kills you. It's not the heroin that kills you. If you were, say, an anesthesiologist and you had access to a never-ending supply of fentanyl, you knew just the right dose, you could take it every single day. You could hold a job down. You could do anything. It's the withdrawal, and usually it's the acquiring of the drug that gets into the really big trouble. People spend all their money. They have to resort to stealing and prostitution, and or they get not unpure doses, and they get something else mixed in there that kills them. But
Oh, is
the
that right?
treatment
I was under the
actually,
impression that the main cause of death from fentanyl was overdosing on fentanyl because you don't know what dose you're taking.
yeah, absolutely.
But wait, are you saying that that's not the case? That it's usually because there's something else in the mix, or
No, that's definitely the case. But I'm saying
okay,
if you're the anesthesiologist, you would know the
right,
exact
right,
direction to put
yes.
them.
I mean, well, that's true of all drugs, isn't it? I mean, so many. If the war on drugs didn't exist, and we could, and addicts could go to a clinic and get a perfectly measured dose of perfectly pure heroin, then there'd be far fewer heroin deaths because everyone
And
would know
that's
what they're
in
taking.
parts of Europe. That's what they're doing. They have
Yeah,
heroin clinics, like in Switzerland, exactly
yeah.
for that purpose.
And so, just sticking on fentanyl, you mentioned that it was invented in the 1950s. It's now used. In fact, when you say that if you were an anesthesiologist, you'd be able to take it successfully. Did you see that horrifying story about the nurse in the northeast of the United States who was stealing fentanyl from a woman's clinic at one of the big university hospitals? And so the women who were being treated for these very invasive procedures, I think it was egg harvesting for IVF that can be really painful, were getting saline solution, and kept explaining to the doctors and the nurses that I'm not anesthetized. Like, this is excruciatingly painful. And everyone was like, "They're pet. I'm sure that you're fine." And it turned out that they were just getting salt water because the nurse was stealing all the fentanyl and using it herself and selling it.
Yeah, that's really too bad. In fact, that's how the whole epidemic started. Anesthesiologists were the first people to get hooked, and to this day, I know it's still a big problem.
So then, why is it the case that in the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen this drug that is, 75 years old, make its way into the mainstream? What was there a killer app that enabled it to start flooding the market?
No, it was the opioid crisis in the U.S., starting with the prescription pills like OxyContin. And so once, they were mismarketed to have people believe that they were non-addictive, and people got addicted in record numbers. And then when their prescriptions ran out, a lot of people turned to street heroin. But there were so many new addicted users that there wasn't enough heroin to go around. And so fentanyl kind of fell into the void there, and people started getting hooked on that. So it's not something anyone ever wanted.
Right.
And the DEA even predicted, they said, don't worry about fentanyl. This was 10 years ago. The DEA published that. They said, it's not going to be a problem. It's too potent. Nothing to see here. And it was only a year later that it was killing record numbers of people.
And presumably the users were somewhat right in the sense that they didn't need heroin. They didn't want heroin necessarily. What they wanted was a facsimile of the high that they were getting from the opioids, right? From OxyContin. They'd gotten addicted to this substance and they wanted a substitute for that substance, and they probably didn't care what it was.
Right, exactly. And it was available to them and it was cheap. And so that's why people turned to street drugs.
And just remind us of the story of the opioid crisis. It's basically that this drug company that is a bit down on its luck, decides to use some shifty tactics to go hard on pressuring drug regulators in the United States to reclassify this opioid as safe and non-addictive, even though everyone who knew what they're talking about was like, this is basically just heroin.
Yeah, I mean, we've known opioids and opiates. I use those terms synonymously, but have been addictive since like the dawn of time. And now all of a sudden, there was one study that came out before all this started that they gave people in hospitals these opioids, and they were in a controlled environment. And this was inpatient only, and they found that people weren't getting addicted in this situation. So basically, they said, it's okay. It's not addictive if, anymore. And so this company, Purdue Pharma and others, ran with this idea that as long as you gave the patients these like big doses, it would last 12 hours at a time. So OxyContin is short for oxy continuous. And so they said, you give them one pill at night, one pill in the morning, you'll be covered. You won't become addicted. Everything will be fine. And then at the same time, doctors were told to start considering pain to be the new vital sign. So you have your vital signs like your heart rate, your breathing rate, stuff like that. And they said, no, now you need to start asking your patients what their pain level is on a scale of 1 to 10. And so I remember being asked this, when I went to see the doctor. He said, oh, you sprained your ankle. What's your pain level? 1 to 10. I said, I don't know, 7.
Yeah.
And
Also, what's 10? I mean, is 10
yeah,
like I've just been attacked by a shark and I don't have any arms or legs? Like what?
yeah, exactly. And so, but then they were trained that if they said, I think it was 8 or higher, that you not only can give them opioids, but you should give them opioids because, people shouldn't be in pain. It's a natural right not to be in pain. And so it was kind of these double influences that led to these opioid pills being prescribed in record numbers, and that opened the floodgates.
And of course, it's not just the drug companies that are training the doctors to dispense their medicines, and not just training, but inducing the doctors to dispense their medicines, like by giving them free shit if they, hit certain prescription targets and things, right? Really corrupt. I mean, this is, to an outsider, no offense to America, but this is part of the insanity of a privatized, healthcare system where profit is so prevalent. That's just inconceivable in a socialized system like Australia, where we have Medicare for all, and there would be no direct interaction between a pharmaceutical company and a
and the advertising on TV, just seeing all these pharmaceutical ads, like, why are we being shown this? We can't, this should be for doctors.
You need some kind of a gatekeeper, as if like you're the best person to decide what drug you should have. But anyway, not only is it the drug company training and inducing the doctor, it's presumably the doctor then training the patient that if the patient gives the correct answer about their pain score, they get to feel really good. Right? So I know that if I just exaggerate how painful it is, I get to get high for the next 12 hours. Of course, I'm going to say my pain's worse than it is.
Yeah, there's no way they can measure that or judge if you're lying. It's just, it's a totally crazy system.
Right. And so what's the mechanism by which it becomes a fully fledged addiction? I guess people are taking these drugs, and then of course some are misusing them. Some might be crushing them up and snorting them and getting a high and whatever. And then the kids, the teenage kids of the people who have the prescriptions start taking them and sharing with them with their friends. And that's how it sort of gets its tendrils into the rest of the community. But then is there also a situation where the person can't necessarily get enough to get high? And like at what point, what link for me, I have neck pain and therefore I go to my doctor and they prescribe me Oxy, and I've been saying OxyContin, but we're talking about oxycodone is the drug, right?
Yeah.
Oxycodone is the drug. OxyContin is the brand name. At what is the link between that prescription and me standing in a car park offering someone a blowjob in order for them to give me fentanyl? How does that happen?
Well, it's different for everybody. I mean, myself, I've taken these pills and they don't do anything for me. And for other people, they take it for their pain. When the pain goes away, they stop and they're fine. They never want to do it again. But, some people have sort of addictive personalities and they start taking these pills. They like the way it makes them feel. It's not just about relieving the pain. In fact, they say after like 6 weeks, it has nothing to do with the pain anymore. You know what I mean? Like if your underlying condition is not fixed by then, you have other problems.
Right. And so are you one of the people who, I think there's a certain number of people, like just genetically or something, who don't have the psychoactive effect of opioids? It doesn't make you feel good.
Yeah, I think I'm lucky enough to be one of those people.
Wow. It makes me feel good. I had one just from around the time that I read your book. I was in Vietnam and went to a dodgy pharmacy and got what was claimed to be OxyContins just to try it out. And
don't do that. Don't do that in Mexico. I wouldn't do it anywhere, but don't do it in Mexico. Those pills are all at those pharmacies in Mexico. They're all fentanyl.
Right. I have some faith that in Asia there's I don't know why I would have this faith, but I think there is I think there is an illicit Indian pharmacy network where they just overproduce drugs from a lot of pharmacies that supply Asia anyway, and they sell them on the black market. But
I would not have as much faith as you, but you survived, I guess.
I survived. So the interesting question about the sort of context of addiction here comes up as well, where you were saying that the drug companies relied on these studies where they would give these pills to people in a hospital setting and then they would release from hospital and they didn't have any addiction problems. This is true, of course, of many types of addiction. There are famous stories of American and Australian GIs who would be in Vietnam and they would take heroin and opium and they'd be totally addicted. Then they'd come home and they wouldn't have withdrawal symptoms, or it wouldn't be a problem for them to get off it because it was so tightly connected to that context that you remove the person from the context and the physiological withdrawals go away. And anyone who's had any kind of addiction, even if it's to caffeine or something, knows that there are these sort of mnemonic triggers throughout your day where, I get up in the morning, I like putting the coffee on. If you do that all the time, then it forms a part of your addiction. If you move to a different city and you didn't have a coffee machine, you weren't getting up in the same place, it wouldn't have the same trigger. So it's crazy that they were ever able to use that as a rationale for claiming that it wasn't addictive. That's not how addiction works.
Well, yeah. No, that study with the Vietnam veterans is really interesting because there is this mentality that once, heroin gets its chemical hooks into you, you're screwed. You can never go back. But this study showed that obviously that's not true. These people came home and they didn't have the same triggers, and the set and setting aspect of what you're talking about is especially familiar to people who take psychedelics, and they say like, you got to be in the right place. You got to be in the right mindset. It's going to make all the difference in the world. And then they've even done studies on like mice with this, and they give them a certain dose of opioids. In one environment, they give them that same dose, every day. The mouse is fine. And then they move the mouse to a new mouse house or whatever, give them the same dose, and they're dead suddenly.
Oh, wow. So there's actually a difference in the physiological toxicity of the thing depending on the context.
Yeah, it's totally it's something that's psychological but can totally have physiological effects. And so it's not just when people say set and setting, it's not just for people tripping out on LSD. I mean, this applies to all drugs, and where you are when you take it, how much you take, totally can affect these factors.
I saw a documentary about, it was interviewing a guy who was using fentanyl, and the reporter, it was cold, it looked like it was in a really cold part of the United States, and the guy was in a car park and he was huddled in like a little nook where the wind was lower, than it wasn't so blustery, and he was an old guy with like a big winter jacket on, and he had some tin foil and he was trying to light it and smoke. Maybe it was a pipe or something, but he was trying to light it and smoke it. And the reporter was like, "Do you mind if I ask you some questions?" He was like, "Yeah, go on." He was like, "Why are you using fentanyl?" And he said, "Well, it's cheap. It's easy to get." And I was like, that is revealing about the mindset of the user. The questioner doesn't mean, was this cheap and easy to get? The questioner means, why the fuck are you, old man, huddled in a freezing corner of a dirty car park trying to light this thing and shove it in your face when you presumably could be doing a million other things with your life in this moment? But for him, it's so self-evident that you would want the hit that his answer relates to the cost effectiveness and the ease of procurement instead of the basic underlying question of like, what the fuck are you doing? And I wonder if you've...
Withdrawal is just, withdrawal is like nothing else. I mean, people compare it to a flu, but I don't think that's the best comparison because, I've had flus where I didn't want to, I wouldn't have sold my soul to get out of it. But, imagine like the worst flu you've ever had in your life where you feel like you're about to die. And imagine now if you could just take a pill or smoke something out some foil and all of a sudden everything would be better. I mean, that's basically what opioid addiction is.
Right. Okay. And that creeps up on you slowly, that feeling of, I mean, because presumably if you took something and then it gave you the worst flu that you've ever had, or like, if people have been really sick with pneumonia or mononucleosis or something like that, where you feel really, really rotten, then you just wouldn't take that thing ever again. You'd note the causal relationship between the ingestion of the substance and the terrible feeling, but addiction doesn't seem to function that way. People don't make that link exactly.
Well, no, it does creep up on you. And at first, it feels incredible. And then you do it again and it still feels great. But eventually it flips and you need to take it just to feel normal. So it's kind of like maybe sliding down a slope very slowly.
Yeah, right. One of the most fascinating sections of your book is where you go to China and you try to actually track down where this stuff is made and where it's coming from and what the delivery system is. This begins with the dark web and like crypto and how people are buying this stuff and Mr. Pill. Can you take us into this dark journey?
Yeah, well, the dark web, you can basically, it sounded too good to be true. I mean, just being able to buy any drug you wanted anonymously, have it shipped right to your door. And there are all these new drugs, is what kind of got me into this project. You know, for centuries, there were just like a handful of drugs. You ate them, you know, maybe you licked the back of a toad and got high. There were some different ways, but in recent years, all the new drugs are made synthetically, so they're made in a lab, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new drugs. And so I learned that almost all of them were being made in China. And so for every like natural drug there was before, now there's a new synthetic version. So you had marijuana, now there's synthetic marijuana. And it's like K2 and spice. Have you heard of that stuff down there?
Yeah. And so when you say synthetic marijuana, you basically mean that a chemist has looked at what the chemical profile of THC is, and they've just replicated something akin to that in the lab that has a similar...
Not exactly. It's more, there's the cannabinoid receptors in the central nervous system. And so THC latches onto those partially. It's called a partial agonist. And that's why it's so chill when you smoke marijuana. You know, it's not a crazy drug experience. It's very relaxed. But these cannabinoids, synthetic cannabinoids, they are full agonists, meaning that they completely grab onto the receptor and it makes your brain like go crazy. And you can watch all these videos online of people losing their minds. But the chemical structure is not like THC at all.
Oh.
It just affects these same receptors.
So how do we discover them? Do chemists look at the cannabinoid receptors and then try to figure out what's going to go into them, or is it trial and error?
Oh, it's totally trial and error. Yeah, it's like and I talk about a chemist in my book who would try stuff on himself. You know, usually these are animal studies, these type of things. But if you're giving, you know, these things to a mouse or even a cat or something, you can't really judge what they're feeling or reacting. So some of these chemists would test it on themselves. But you know, there's potential medical uses for this stuff, and there's a ton of potential. But what happened was that all these medical studies on these new drugs, these cannabinoids, these new opioids, you know, all these new drugs, they start in medical settings or in scientific settings, and the chemists publish their findings, and they try to patent the drug. They try to, you know, make money off it. But most of these fail, and there's never a medical use that's determined. But these papers stick around, these studies, and so once the internet really came to fruition, all these drug chemists just started going on the internet and reading these old scientific studies and getting all these drug recipes. And they said, well, this didn't work as a medical product, but it gets you high, I'm sure. And started making it as drugs.
And then selling it on the dark web, at the risk of making this sound like it's a 101 for your grandmother. Where is the dark web, and how do I get on the dark web, and how do I pay on the dark web? And, you know, when the thing from the dark web arrives, why isn't the FBI intercepting it when I enter the actual physical address? Like, at some point, I'm still a bit confused about the interface between the dark web and real life. Like, why isn't there an interception point between the activities on the dark web and when they then come into reality? How do I get the drugs that I order on the dark web?
Well, the dark web just means that everything that can't be accessed by your normal browser, your normal Chrome or Firefox browser or whatever. So anyone can get on the dark web. You just need this special onion browser called Tor. You can put it on your smartphone. It's very easy. You can find these dark websites on Reddit very easily. But then once you go on there, the way that you communicate with the dealers is through all these encrypted messages. And so, why can't the FBI decrypt them? Well, the FBI is not that smart. I mean, it's
Right.
very
And when you
hard
say
to.
it's encrypted messages, are you then leaving, pardon my ignorance about the dark web, I haven't experimented with it, but you download a special browser that can access this portion of the internet that is not available to anybody else through a conventional browser. And then once you make contact with a drug dealer, are you then exiting that ecosystem and going to a conventional encrypted app like Telegram or Signal or something? Or are you staying inside that browser?
Well, when I did it, we stayed inside, the site. We used a special encrypted technology, but you can do it anyway, I'm sure.
Right.
Basically, just the idea is that they don't know who you really are, and you don't know who they really are, and the FBI is none the wiser.
Right, but at some point you have to procure the actual thing, and then you become a human being in the real world when you pick up a package somewhere.
Yeah, so they sent it, you give them your address, they send it. So the 2 points that law enforcement could intercept it, right, is at the point where it's being sent and the point where it's being arrived. Well, the point that's being sent, you can mislabel the package, obviously. You can do some sort of anonymous drop that's not tied to you. And then on the receiving end, that's where they would be most likely to catch you. But how much mail is delivered from the US, from China to the US? There's I don't know, hundreds of millions of packages per year. And the FBI or anyone can't possibly keep track of all that. So there's a small chance you'll get caught, but not a big one.
Right. I mean, is it conceivable that in coming years, AI and better technology finds a way around this by just bulk screening everything or finding, some kind of signature that we haven't thought about yet that would raise the likelihood that something is one of these packages?
Well, it's possible, but the whole point of capitalism is to do everything as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so for something like this to work, you'd also have to slow down everyone's Christmas packages from Amazon in China, and so would people be willing to pay that? I mean, right now, Trump put all these tariffs on China, and so the U.S. mail even shut down accepting packages from China for a couple of days. And obviously, there's going to be a huge uproar if people can't get their fidget spinner, for their birthday. I mean, I just don't think it's feasible.
So the synthetic things that people are buying on the dark web, there are these big illegal drug vendors, right? And when you encounter them on the dark web, do they look legit? Do they look not shady? Do they have do they hire the correct people to put the proper kind of branding and logos on it that make it look amenable and kosher to a Western audience? Or do you feel like you're in a dark alley?
I mean, you can't trust anything. You can't trust the branding. There actually are Amazon style reviews sometimes. So people will review their products and the shipping, and that is probably the best indicator. But, you heard of the Silk Road, which was the biggest of these early dark websites. Well, when that got shut down and the guy was sent to prison, Trump just pardoned him, actually. But after that was shut down, a new site popped up called the Silk Road 2. And that everyone, probably thought that had nothing to do with the other Silk Road. It's just someone decided to run with the branding. And then there was a third Silk Road later, and, you can't trust any of that stuff.
What's the pardon all about?
I think Trump said something like he thought it was judicial overreach, and I think he identified because he too felt he had been victimized by the American criminal justice system, and so he saw a kindred spirit. This guy Ross Ulbricht was a champion by libertarian groups, and so that's a part of Trump's base.
Right. Okay, so there's a nexus here between the kind of crypto bro libertarian, we're ushering in a new future which will be free from fiat currencies and government overreach, where anyone can do anything, and it will be a glorious new future. And the price that we have to pay for that is that there'll be a few nefarious things on the side, like people buying child pornography and drugs and sending funding for terrorism. But that's a price worth paying in order to escape the yoke of some one world government that is inevitably coming as an alternative. Is that the thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a libertarian. I'm sure they would say there's some utopian version of what you just said that's feasible. But yeah, I think generally that makes sense.
Right. So these kinds of drugs, there are synthetic drugs. Chemists are trying them out on themselves. There are bunches of new drugs. But fentanyl, as you said, is not a new drug. This is an old one. So at some point, the dark web and crypto start to facilitate the production of, I was going to say synthetic fentanyl, but it is synthetic, right? The production of fentanyl in Chinese labs in order to service this new demand. I mean, this also scrambles things for me because we always talk in the United States and the West about fentanyl as being a sort of a supply problem, that like we have to crack down on it coming in from the border because they're not sending their best people, they're sending rapists and drug dealers, and China is flooding us with fentanyl. But China didn't wake up one day and decide to flood the United States with fentanyl. Like America woke up one day and was like, I really love opioids. I need more of this stuff. And China was like, okay, we can do that. So there's a demand, like everything is driven by demand fundamentally. Supply replies to demand, right?
Well, what I found in my book was that the Chinese government was actually incentivizing these chemical companies to export fentanyl. They were giving financial incentives. They were giving grants to these companies. They were giving them tax breaks and things like that. And this was not some sort of nefarious plot to kill Americans, not a reverse opium war like a lot of people have thought, but it was just purely like trying to increase the success of the Chinese pharmaceutical industry. And so China actually has the biggest chemical and pharmaceutical industry in the world. But the U.S. is, although it's smaller, makes more money because the U.S. has all the name brands. And so China's government was trying to get their chemical industry up the sort of value add ladder, if you will. Do you know what I mean? Instead of making all these cheap generics, they wanted them to start making chemicals that sold for more money, that were more valuable. And so fentanyl was one of those, because like we've said, fentanyl is a important hospital drug. It's like a blockbuster drug in itself. And so they said, if you export fentanyl, you get a 13% tax rebate. And so these companies, the problem was they didn't put any safeguards in there to say only if you're doing it for legitimate purposes, you get the tax break. It was everyone got it. And so then it was off to the races for these Chinese chemical companies.
Okay, so that somewhat contradicts what I just said in the sense that there was a demand push here, and was that wasn't purely responsive to. There was a supply push here that wasn't purely responsive to the demand that was arising from the opioid crisis, or was this just a happy accident that the two happened at roughly the same time? The increase in Chinese production and the increase in demand from American opioid addicts.
I think the demand side kind of drove it at first because these chemical companies, they'll really do anything. You know what I mean? Like this company where I went undercover in Wuhan, they said they could make 10,000 chemicals. They'll make whatever you want, custom order. And once the American demand side started wanting fentanyl, that's when these companies really ramped up production.
Got it. And so fentanyl is in production in a major way in China. You contact someone on the web. How do you reach out, and what are your initial overtures to try to pull off this undercover malarkey?
Well, I said, can I visit your factory, your lab when I come to China? And this,
and you're posing as what, a drug dealer?
Yeah, I said my name was Johnny Webster, and that I actually said I wasn't the drug dealer, but my friend was, and that I just happened to be coming to China, and that if the lab passed our quality requirements, then my friend would make this big order.
To hear the rest of this conversation, go to uncomfortableconversations.substack.com/listen, and you will get your own personal premium podcast feed with at least 3 extra episodes of the podcast every month and heaps of extra stuff, including the remainder right now of the fabulous conversation you've just been hearing. If it was worth listening to this much of, don't rob yourself of the rest. Pull out your phone right now and search for Uncomfortable Conversations on Substack.